Even men at the top of their game find themselves wanting more from life. Whether it's more meaning, unshakable confidence, a bigger impact, more money, deeper love, a hotter sex life, or a powerful legacy. Find out how good your life can be on this episode of Man Alive. Also, as I've supported men in their love and work lives for 15 years now, many men ask for the right words to say to be more successful, attractive, and desirable. But I found it's not so simple as giving scripts or lines because every man is different. So giving words or scripts would be like giving a tall, thin man a shorter, wider man's pants, or vice versa. The words have to make sense for you and your personality, and there's so much happening beneath the surface that people are responding to. If you're interested in how to become a better lover and leader in your own unique way, go to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz, or you can text ALIVE to 44144. It only takes a couple minutes and you'll start to get an idea of how you can be both more respected and desired. After you fill it out, we can schedule a time to review your quiz and talk about your specific challenges and desires. So again, go to either shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text ALIVE to 44144. That's ALIVE to 44144. Enjoy this episode of Man Alive. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Man Alive. I'm excited to be here today, and we have an incredible guest who I was on his podcast last week, Christopher Veal. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here. And you were the first female guest on my podcast.
I was.
Thank you very much. You know that. Yes.
No, I feel deeply
She acts
honored.
all surprised. Oh, was I?
I feel deeply honored by that and really excited to have you here to talk about evolving masculinity and all the amazing things that you have done and are doing. You're the author of The Whole Man, and the subtitle is Evolving Masculinity. Mm-hmm. You also have the Vulnerable Man podcast, and your TEDx talk is called Deeper Connection, Better World, which, you know, that's definitely part of my mission as well. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I love about you is whenever I talk to you, my heart feels so open and I feel supported as a woman. And I feel how you have this very safe, very loving presence. And you also were an officer in the Marine Corps for, I think, almost a decade.
Yep, 9 years.
9 years. You worked in the construction industry for a long time.
6.5 more years. Yep.
Great. Okay. So you've really spanned the spectrum. You know, you've touched into some of the most hardcore masculine, what do you want to call those? You know, spaces, experience. Yeah. So the fact that you are now talking about vulnerability and, you know, whole man and evolving masculinity is beautiful to me. So how did the shift happen for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. So grateful for the opportunity to be here. And actually, that was a beautiful compliment that like you feel seen and all that. So yes, that made me smile too. Yeah. To your question about how did I get here? Yes. So the fact that I spent 9 years in the Marine Corps, 6.5 years in construction, which are very touchy-feely fields, if you didn't know that already, he says in the sarcasm.
Oh, I was like,
yeah,
what?
You don't know. It was a great opportunity to see a way that men are expected to show up.
Yes.
And what I realized is when I was working in the construction industry, that was when my daughter was born. And one of the things that really helped shift for me was I had to help educate my organization on paternity leave. And it wasn't a fault of their own. They were kind of a family business and had never really dealt with it. Never had a man take time off. And so they had to find their way through it. But I had a lot of
I don't want to say demanded, but that was part of your...
I was legally obligated, or it was entitled to me as part of, paid family leave here in California, although they ran it under the disability the disability, but I was entitled to it.
You were entitled to it. Amazing.
Absolutely. And so I knew I wanted to, because growing up with a single mother who didn't have a father present, I knew I wanted to be engaged in my child's birth and life.
Yeah.
And there were a number of guys that, and no fault of their own, they were an older generation than me, but I would get comments like, "Oh, what are you taking maternity leave for?" They were very clear in saying maternity leave because they didn't know paternity leave existed. Or raising kids is women's work. I would get comments like that, which only strengthened my resolve, because I thought, you know what, great, like that's the examples you had, and I'm going to show up differently. And so my daughter was a big catalyst for my really leaning into this. Shortly after she was born is when I discovered Brene Brown's work around vulnerability, her first talk, and then especially her second one, right? Listening to Shame. And there's a piece in it that I always talk about where she was signing books and this man comes up and he says, why don't you study men? And she goes, oh, I don't do that. And he's like, wasn't that convenient? And when he said, my wife and daughter, who you just signed those books for, would rather I die up on my horse than fall off of it. And like that just hit home for me. And I was like, oh, that's what I've been feeling. Because there's this expectation as a former Marine, like you've got to be this big, tough, burly guy, not show emotions. And so I realized that didn't feel right to me. I felt like I had to just bring parts of myself, but I couldn't bring all of myself. And so as I dug into it more, I realized, okay, I need to figure out what vulnerability means to me and what my relationship with it is. And how do I do that and continue the conversation so that other men are willing to be in it too?
Wow. I mean, what I'm really appreciating in this moment is that you had it's almost like the way I'm seeing it is like this surround sound or the capacity to witness yourself having this conversation with yourself, and not like most men I think get stuck in that place of my wife, my daughter, the people in my life would rather me die on this horse than fall off of it, and fall into the box, the trap, there is no other way.
Right.
But somehow you saw beyond that.
I'd like to say I was wise and it happened that way, and it didn't quite. Like I started to be aware of it, but I didn't really accept it or understand it. And one of the other big things that made a shift for me is in January of 2014, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And as a result, at that time, then I was the sole provider in the household because my wife wasn't working. And I had to be a father, and I had to be the breadwinner, and I had to be the son flying back to take care of my mom who had no other children. So I ended up burning myself out, and I didn't realize it. And it was after that I really realized, wow, like I had this idea that I've got to be able to do it all, and it's just not doing me any good, and it's not doing anyone else any good. And so that's what really helped me go, okay, Christopher, like this, can I cuss here?
You can cuss.
Yes. Okay. That shit don't work. Right.
Yeah. That shit don't fly.
Right. Right. And I'm not going to be able to sustain this. And it's not serving me or my world. And so that really had me go, okay, so what do I need to do to shift that? And that's when things started to change for me.
Yeah. And how amazing to see, okay, this isn't serving me. It's not serving my world.
Right.
And one of the things I love bringing to men is that you matter, right? Like
absolutely,
you as a human, as a man matter. And so if it's not, it used to be that, what was that joke? Like happy wife, happy life.
Yep. Absolutely.
Right. But if you're not happy and you're not thriving,
right,
the world is not going to be a better place.
My boss at the time, she was amazing. And like, I didn't tell anybody at work what was going on for months. And I eventually ran out of leave because and my boss said to me, well, what's going on? And when I told her, she said, I wish you had told me. We could have set up so that they would have, and I can't remember what it was, like emergency leave or something. So I could have not burned from leave, but I didn't think to say, hey, here's what's going on. Because at work, you're supposed to just take care of work. You're not supposed to bring your personal life.
Right.
And that was also a good reminder for me, not only was this a person I trusted and I had a lot of respect for, but even if I'd been willing to be open and just say, here's something that I'm dealing with, not that you have to do anything about it, would have opened some doors for resources for me that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah. Wow. And I think so many men are living in that place.
Absolutely. Right.
And, the shame and the growing up being told that you're supposed to be a certain way.
Absolutely. There's also a bit of a stigma that and it's completely not true, but I think it gets reinforced a lot that if as a man, you don't act like you have all the answers or you're going to get it right all the time, you're seen as less than or weak. And so there's this false narrative that we buy into thinking, okay, well, I've always got to act like I've got all my stuff together or else, they're not going to see me as committed to the organization. And that's just not true. I mean, there's so many people talking about burnout now that are poking holes in that myth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love working with men around a new way of defining confidence, right? That confidence is more about the capacity to meet whatever comes your way, right? With all of you and with a sense of possibility as opposed to, oh, I know what I'm doing. I know how to do this.
Right.
And I've seen that, right, create a change for a lot of men. And it sounds like that is something that you've developed too. I don't know if you would put it in the same way.
Right. When I started to look at some of the leaders that I had the most respect for, or that I had either worked for or worked around or seen, one of the things I realized is they were likely to say, I don't have all the answers, or I need help.
Yeah.
And even if they didn't have the answers, it wouldn't be, I don't know what to do, but it would be, and how do we figure it out together?
Yes, that's so different.
And those leaders were the ones, like my first company commander when I was in the Marine Corps. Like if my phone rang right now and he said, Christopher, pack your bags, I need you here, I'd be like, got it,
You would
on my
be there
way.
in a second.
And I don't need to know where we're going or how long. That's how much respect I have for that man.
Yeah.
Because he was willing to be vulnerable, even though I wouldn't have used that word back then.
Right.
But he let himself be real and show up. And that to me created this connection, this bond. And so that's part of what I do with the leaders that I work with too, is help them lean into, how can you bring a little more vulnerability so that people see you as human, not just this stoic, and men or women or however people identify, but how do they see you more human? Because that's what people want to relate to.
Right. And want to serve and be loyal to. And okay, so I want to hear about vulnerability, but I want to go back to your commander just for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
What was it, or how did he talk to you and your, the officers?
I think the thing is, he was just willing to be himself. So he was a little bit goofy, and that wasn't your typical stereotype image of a Marine. Mm-hmm. He was also very competent. You knew that whatever he asked you to do, he would be willing to do and could do. So there was a way that he created respect, but he let himself be himself too, as opposed to, I don't want to say this caricature of what was expected, but there are, I've got some great friends that I served with, and some of them very much bought into that. I've got to be this certain way. Like, I even noticed as I do it, like I have to sit up a little more and my shoulders
puff up your chest.
Right? Exactly. And there's this expectation of that's the image you have to be. But what I also know, right? I served a combat tour in Iraq. The bond that you have, like those Marines love each other. They might not say, I love you.
Right.
But that bond is stronger than some people who say, I love you.
Yeah.
And we just need to find out, how do we help them feel comfortable saying it? Because if I said that to one of my Marines, like my best buddy, when I went through my officer candidate school and my training, if I said, I love you, while I was in the Marine Corps, people would have been like, whoa, what's up with that? Right. Yeah. This ain't don't ask, don't tell time. But it's not that at all. And we need to pull that stuff apart.
Yes. I love that. Pulling that apart so that it actually could be normal, right? It's not like, oh, now we have to find a different way to say it, but how do we actually welcome that?
For the longest time, vulnerability was a 4-letter word that I wouldn't say in mixed company, right? Oh no, I'm not going to say that.
No way.
What I've realized is, the more I'm willing to say, which is part of the reason I chose the vulnerable man for the podcast. Because I was like,
I imagine that was a vulnerable title to choose. Yeah.
And what I realized is, if I can't be comfortable saying the word, how can I expect other people to start feeling comfortable?
Yes. Yes. I love that you're willing to go first.
Yeah. It isn't always easy, but I know that's what I've got to do.
Right. Definitely not always easy. And, probably usually not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
one of the other, well, I was going to say, one thing I've learned though, is it's not about actually what it is for me. Because for the longest time, I reacted to how people reacted to it.
Yeah.
And I had to remind myself, it's not about them. Because
their reactions to you.
Mm-hmm. If they get triggered by my vulnerability, that's not about me.
Yeah.
That's about them and their experience. And I have to remember, I need to keep leaning in.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. And why? Like, what does it do for you as you keep leaning in? What becomes possible for you as you become more vulnerable?
Sure. The word I'll use is connection. I become more connected with myself first and foremost in a real and honest way.
Yeah.
And it allows me to show up and connect better with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So can we talk a little bit more about vulnerability? And, you've interviewed many, mostly men, except for me on your podcast. And I think each conversation, men talk about their own vulnerability, and you get to have, bring in your vulnerability. So what are some of the things that you've learned through having this podcast about vulnerability?
Sure. Well, I'll even go back a little before that. Back in 2016, I just started interviewing men about the subject of vulnerability and what gets in the way. Great. No ideas or design of a podcast, but I knew I wanted to understand how other men were seeing it. And as I went along, it began unpacking how I was seeing it too. And so I interviewed hundreds of men over the next several years. Just, I think there were 5 questions I had around it. And really, it was like, what does vulnerability mean to you? What gets in the way, especially with other men? I was very curious about that because a number of the men I talked to, regardless of how they identified in terms of sexual orientation, often felt more comfortable being vulnerable on women, but didn't do so around men. And so I really wanted to unpack that. And some of the common themes, which aren't going to be a newsflash, but there was a lot of shame or judgment that would often come up. And this belief that if I show vulnerability, these guys that are my friends, my best friends, are going to see me as less than. And then I would usually say, so if your best friend, if he shared something with you that he was struggling, what would you think of him? And almost every man would say, I'd have like something like, I'd have a lot of respect for him.
Wow.
I'd appreciate his courage. I'd have more like empathy for him. I think he's amazing for me able to say it. And then I'd just sit back and I'd wait. And the light bulb
wait for the light bulb to go off.
And they go, oh, wait a minute. So when I think of vulnerability in others, I see it as an asset or a strength. But when I think of being vulnerable, I see it as something that's a weakness. And so that would start to shift things a little. And so, you know, it's what I've also realized is that a lot of men want the opportunity to be more vulnerable. We don't always feel safe.
Yes. Agreed.
When we think about the workplaces, when we think about the messaging that young boys get growing up, it orients us to hide emotions, to not feel them, to be less vulnerable, because that's not what a real man does. And so we wonder why later on in life, men are struggling with some of these things. And we don't feel safe being more vulnerable.
I mean, I really believe that there are different roles that we all have to play in making it safer for men to be vulnerable. Right. You know, I talk to women a lot about this idea that, okay, if you're with a man who falls apart or has moments of emotionality or whatever, that, you know, there can be a fear that some women have expressed that, okay, now my man the rock is gone, falling apart. And so how can we as women be strong enough to have our own backs while also open to surrendering and, you know, being soft and right. And that that it doesn't have to be all one way.
Well, it's ironic because there's almost a double standard, right? And again, like, women want us to accept their strength, but also their vulnerability. But for some men, if we show that we don't have it all together, like, oh, wait a minute. You know, I've talked to guys that in dating, somebody that was on my podcast recently, he said he went on a date with someone and she said, wow, you are probably the most vulnerable and like emotionally available man I've ever met. And that scares me. And then she ghosted him.
Oh, man.
And couldn't handle it. Right. Now, he didn't take it personal. I mean, maybe he did. I don't know. But like, he moved on from it. But you also look at the narrative that even little girls get growing up. And again, I know I'm speaking binary. We're beyond that in our world. We talked about last week. But you think about growing up, who is it that girls usually chase after? The bad boy. You look in the movies. The woman chases the bad boy. Goes and cries on the shoulder of the good guy, the nice guy, but then wants to go back after the bad boy. So the message the boys get is, oh, if I want to get the girl, I got to be that aloof, emotionless, treat him like an asshole. And then I'm going to get the girl because the nice guy finishes last.
I love nice guys and I love working with them to really bring out, you know, that I don't even know what to call it because I feel like it's all going to sound so cliche in this moment, but you know, that you guys with huge hearts and care and love and respect for women, you know, it would be interesting to hear from this guy who went on the date and what happened and why. And we all have our own individual reactions and so do women. But that way, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about shame. It's like the more shame we have internally around acting a certain way, the more other people feel that. So, you know, supporting men, and I think part of what you do this too, it's like the less shame you have around being vulnerable, the stronger you become, and the less you need to prove or defend or, you know, have any of that out in the world that then pushes people away or has women feel like, whoa, something's happening inside that's different from outside.
Right. I think part of it is we need to start showing examples of men being vulnerable. So that becomes the norm and not the exception.
I love that. Yes.
You know, I think about my generation. So I'm going to be 52 this year. But I think of my generation and the examples that those fathers had growing up. Now, I don't fault them. And the men that I've interviewed, like, they don't fault their fathers either because they were operating off of what they had. But even if we're talking, again, we'll get our binary sense here for a minute of men and women, the examples they had of father figures who are the first, usually the first major role model that they have for men. And if dad doesn't cry, if dad doesn't show emotions, if dad is very, I got it all together all the time, then that's unconsciously what we build as that's what a man is.
Right.
And so whether I identify as a man or a woman, I think that's what a man is supposed to be.
Yes.
And so the more we can show that there's other ways to be a man, that's, I think, where we start to make a real difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I was just thinking about media and movies and TV shows and all of those places that I'm starting to see a shift in. I was watching a show last night where the man had gone through a divorce and he went through this, horrible experience, got in a car crash because, he wasn't willing to open up and be vulnerable with others. And if finally they showed the transformation of what happened and how supported he was when he got vulnerable. Right. I thought it was very powerful to see, like, that's a journey that I think many men go through. It's like, oh, I've got to crash a car or have something major happen and fall apart before I'm actually willing to show this part.
Right. And even then they might not be willing to.
Right.
The narrative is men don't go to therapy. The only time they go to therapy is if they're going to couples counseling or something like that.
Yeah.
And, there's a gentleman, Dexter Spitz is what he goes by. Jordan, I can't think of his last name right now, but he has this thing, How Men Cry. And he's collecting stories of how men cry because he wants to normalize the idea of, men going to therapy.
Yes.
When I was in the Marine Corps, there's no way I would have said
no way.
I talk about it all the time now because it was helpful for me.
Yeah.
And again, we need to change the way that we see it. Even in the movies and TV, the emotionally available guy is usually the comic sidekick. He's the comic relief. He's not often the main character, your hero. And so the message that also implies is, to be the star of the show, you've got to be this alpha male type of guy.
Yeah.
And the guy that's not, like, you're on the side, you're the tag along. And that doesn't help the cause either.
Yeah. Okay. Vulnerability to me seems like a part of the whole man, right?
Yes.
But I want to hear more about what you mean in your book and how you describe what is the whole man to you.
Right. For me, I say that the book took me 6 months and 50 years to write. Right? You can relate. You wrote a book as well.
Yeah.
And what I realized is I was feeling like I could only let parts of myself show up at certain times and certain things. And really, to be all of myself, I needed to step into, what I viewed as being the whole man and the elements of it. And in it, I was very conscious in choosing the subtitle of Evolving Masculinity, because what I wanted to do was look at what are the things that hold men in unhealthy masculinity. And there's a lot historically, but I chose evolving in particular because what I know is I didn't want to throw out everything that it meant to be a man, because there are some good qualities too.
Yes, right. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's some stuff that needs to go away. And so to me, when I looked at it, when organisms evolve in nature, they keep things that are working, they get rid of things that don't, and then they adopt new behaviors in order to be able to thrive in their new environment. And that's why, to me, I wanted to do that, because let's keep what's working for masculinity, and then how do we expand it? And a core theme to it all is shifting from this either or mentality that is usually associated with what I call unhealthy masculinity, and moving more towards both and.
Yeah.
So the examples I like to use is unhealthy masculinity would say either I can be a provider or I can be a caregiver.
Right.
Healthy masculinity can say I can be a caregiver and a provider.
And beautiful.
Right? Yeah. And so it's a way of how do we create space to be more expansive and allow more ways to view what masculinity is.
Yes. That's great. Right. That you don't have to cut off. There's a philosopher, Ken Wilber, who talks about transcend and include, right? We move forward and we transcend where we've been, but we're also including and not just throwing out the pieces that work.
Right. Yeah. And as I was writing the book, what I came up with is, because I'm a big believer in acronyms, and I talk a lot about, comic books and action heroes in the movie.
Great.
And what I really decided was, like, the superpower of the whole man is vulnerability. I know that, and I embrace that. That's my superpower. And when I lean into it, I'm capable of amazing things. Wow. But the habits that I created for the whole man are curiosity, awareness, presence, emotional health, and stay. And it spells CAPES, ironically. Hence the image.
Okay, will you read it again one more time?
CAPES. So it's curiosity, awareness, presence, emotional health, and stay. And so what each is stay. In a bottom line, curiosity, it's about a question or a wondering or an openness to explore.
Yeah.
Awareness is recognizing where you are and where you need to go.
Mm-hmm.
With presence, this is one that I struggled with a lot in my life before, but it's about being able to slow down and connect, to filter out the distractions going on in your world, and to be present to your life in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional health is about building and sustaining emotional well-being, what I call developing emotional fitness.
Yeah.
And lastly, it's about stay, which means you got to remain and do the work and not run when it gets hard. And when you can practice those habits, that really has you step into being a whole man in many, if not all aspects of your life. And here's the thing, I say the whole man, but it applies to anybody.
Right. It's like it's whole person. But I think these are things that men have tended to be taught are not for men.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was thinking about curiosity because I had a client yesterday who was asking a question like, why are women like this? And I said, okay, what if you asked it in a way that you're actually genuinely curious, right? What if you actually tried to understand what was going on over there, as opposed to what so many of us do? We put a period on the end of a question and we're just like in a huff, it's a frustration of like, why is this happening? But we don't even actually consider.
So right. Well, I'd even say, and so what's going on in you?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's this other looking, and it's also noticing, but like, what's going on for you?
Powerful.
Because it feels like there's almost a bit of judgment. Oh, them. And it may be, again, we have all these beliefs that are put on us from our upbringing, but I'd also say get curious. And so what is it about yourself that you need to take a look at or explore?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. We were looking at, right. Okay. From there, how, any dynamic, it takes two to tango. So any dynamic you are contributing to, and how do we, with love and compassion, get curious about ourselves instead of with the shame or the blame?
Right. And true curiosity, not questions that lead the witness to the answer I want you to say,
right,
but really being open to hearing it. Yeah. And I like to say, listening is a powerful tool, but you need to listen to understand, not listen to respond.
Oh, yes. I appreciate that, especially as a woman, though, again, like we said, this is not gendered, but when someone really listens to understand me, especially when a man who's in my life does that, there's nothing like it, right? I feel so much, I feel known, I feel appreciated, I feel loved. It's powerful. Yeah. Okay. What else feels important to you? I know we could, talk for days about this, but is there anything else that feels important before we wrap up for today?
There's probably a ton of things. I guess I just want to say we talked about this last week when you were on my podcast, but I am so appreciative of the work that you're doing to help men step into and step beyond some of these stories, these narratives that we've created that aren't serving us. And yeah, it's just what I learned is when I first started the podcast in particular, I was like, okay, it'll be me talking sometimes and I might have some guests, because I thought there's no way guys are going to want to talk about vulnerability. And that was my own vulnerability getting in the way.
Yes.
And then I interviewed my first guest and I said, screw that. I'm doing nothing but interviews now, because what I realized is it's not about me. I want to highlight other men's stories, because somebody may not relate to Christopher's story, but if they hear Bill's story or Tom's story, they may go, I can relate. And it's had me, just interact with some amazing people over the years, way beyond what I would have thought of. And I love that I'm finding more and more allies in this work, even though they do it in slightly different ways. So this is a big kudos to you and what you do, and the way that you are changing the way men can show up in relationships with themselves and their world.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I feel like, we're both doing that in very similar ways, right? Interestingly. And the topic of vulnerability is important to both of us. And I really started imagining, something hit me last week about what would happen really. I mean, this has been my mission for a long time, but really what the world would be like if men's vulnerability was welcomed and supported. Imagine if every man had that support.
That's a world I'm working towards.
Ooh, wow.
How amazing would that be?
Yeah. I mean, because so much of the power over and the domination and war, all of that, it's like, you can't be deeply loved and supported in your most vulnerable places and then go out there and attack in those ways.
I think we will have hit the tipping point when we start to see that happening in politics, at least here in the US.
Yeah.
But there's very much this unhealthy masculinity type of mindset. Like, I've got to win. I've got to be right. You're always wrong type of thinking. regardless of which side of the fence you sit on.
Yeah.
And that doesn't serve. So how do we create space there? So when I see that starting
Any
to happen in
ideas?
politics, then oh my, well, first they should read the book and start.
Yes.
But you know, honestly, I think we need to start expecting men to behave in the way we want them to be.
Wow.
So when men are behaving in unhealthy ways in terms of being a man or masculine, don't allow that. Don't tolerate it. Don't make excuses for it. And when men are showing healthy masculinity, those are the things that we need to celebrate.
Seriously celebrate.
Hold up and say, this is the way you should be showing up, so that we get to a point where people won't tolerate anything but.
Right. And I was just thinking that lack of tolerance doesn't have to come with shaming and blaming. And I don't think it even works that way.
No, because again, some men, they grow up with the example that they saw, right? And so if you tell me all of a sudden everything I ever learned from my father is wrong, like, I don't even know what that's going to do to somebody's psyche. But even just saying, okay, that worked then, that's not where we're at now. And in order to really show up and be an ally, I mean, we're recording this on International Women's Day of all times, right?
Yes.
You know, how do you really be an ally and be a part of the change that needs to happen, as opposed to the example that keeps getting cited of why it isn't working?
Yes. Okay. So how do you then, as a man, if you see an example of someone, a man or anybody exhibiting unhealthy masculine behavior, do you have an example of how you would relate to that?
Yeah. You know, I think it would be, you're very right that you can't shame the person, but what I might, and again, it depends on the situation. I might call it out in the space, depending on what was going on. At the very least, I'd want to have a conversation with the person and just, you know, point them to the impact they created.
Yeah.
Not everybody's open to the feedback or open to changing, but if they sometimes notice the impact it had in the space, they might not have been aware before, you know? So again, with not having a specific example in mind, it's hard to say, but I'm less tolerant of Christopher 5-10 years ago might have said, oh, you know, whatever. Now I will say, you know what? No, not going to tolerate that. And if somebody gets upset, okay, I'm really not worried about it. Like, I'm not worried about being your best friend, but I'm more committed to creating a world where there's healthy masculinity for my daughter to grow up in than I am to my own comfort.
That is powerful. And I imagine you in that situation. I mean, in a way, it takes the work of working through your own shame to be able to stand up for that.
Right.
And also some trust that, you know, other people will show up with you and will join you, as opposed to then kicking you out of the tribe, right? There's definitely a belonging.
Right. You know, and also say part of it too is having people around me that will hold me accountable too, because I am unlearning 5 decades worth of what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
And there's times where, even though I have the best of intentions, I might not get it right.
Yeah.
And so having people around me can say, hey, Christopher, you're not practicing what you preach.
Yeah.
Or that thing you just did, that actually didn't work.
Yeah.
And so then they get to have a conversation with me and help me learn and grow, because I'm continually growing too. And so there's this idea of not just be willing to hold other people accountable, but making sure I'm holding myself accountable as well.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's the only way it can work.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And again, having some grace and compassion. There's people that are trying to, you know, again, unlearn a lot of behaviors, and it won't happen overnight. So we also need to remember that when people are trying, not to crucify them if they don't get it right. You know, cancel culture is a big thing. And I see a lot of leaders that start to try and do the right thing, and they make one misstep.
Right.
And the year that they spent doing all that good just gets thrown out the window because they did this one thing. And we also need to realize, okay, so that one thing, that was stupid, but look at the grand total of things they're doing. And like, are they moving in the right direction?
Yes.
You know, I use the example of when a baby's first learning to walk, the first time it falls, you don't go, oh, no, bad baby, you don't know how to walk.
Bad baby, just give up. Don't walk again.
We encourage them. And we need to do that with people that are trying to change for the better as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here and for your work in the world. And any last, I don't want to call it advice, but any last words of wisdom for a man who's on that edge of opening to his own vulnerability?
Sure. Just do it. Now, you don't need to go and share your deepest, darkest secret with complete strangers, but you know, if you're struggling a little bit, tell a friend. Let them know, you know what, I'm just having a hard time. There's nothing they need to do with it, but don't keep it in. You know, men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide in the US than anyone else. And that's ridiculous because we aren't willing to talk about it. So reach out, let somebody know you're struggling. Chances are they're not going to lock you out of their lives. They're going to appreciate you. And
chances are they're struggling too, and they're going to open up about the ways that they're struggling, and then you can actually feel safer.
What a crazy idea. Yeah. So go first. That's what I'll say.
Awesome. And where can people find more of you?
Sure. So if you want to learn more about the book, go to wholemanjourney.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I've got the term Vulnerability Vanguard, and the podcast is vulnerable-man.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Shana.
I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode of Man Alive. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and it gave you something to consider and explore in your life. If you like what you heard, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe and write a quick review that helps men like you find us. And again, head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text the word ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 to get a sense of how you can become a better lover and leader. You'll start to see how you can be both more respected and desired in your unique and genuine way. If you don't feel as confident or as excited about life or love as you'd like to be, this quiz is a really great starting point and will guide you toward a more passionate love life and a more inspiring and successful career. So again, text ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 or head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz. Join us each week for a new episode of Man Alive.